Hey there! Welcome back to Civic U. I'm Erin Bachowski, and I'm the school community coordinator at Lincoln Northeast High School in Lincoln, Nebraska.
And I'm Chelsea Eggenberger, the school community coordinator at Lincoln High, CLC, in Lincoln, Nebraska. And today we will continue our readings from The Young People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn and adapted by Rebecca Steffa.
We left off last time learning about the Roaring Twenties and the hard times of the Great Depression, which led to another time of conflict. Tensions around the world eventually led to America entering World War II.
Today's lessons will provide further context to why America entered the war and the impacts that had for those at home and across the sea. We'll also learn more about the Red Scare as fear of communism took over the country.
Today, we want our readers to walk away with an understanding of what conflicts were at the heart of World War II, why the United States entered into World War II, the impacts of the war on Japanese Americans, who benefited from the wartime economy and who didn't, and the impacts of the United States' response to communism and how it affected those at home and abroad.
Stay with us as we turn now to the text.
Chapter 16, World War II and the Cold War. World War I was only about 20 years in the past when another huge war began in Europe. Some call it the most popular war the United States ever fought. 18 million Americans served in the armed forces, and 25 million gave money from their paychecks to support the war. It was a war against evil, the evil of Germany's Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler. After coming to power in Germany, the Nazis began attacking Jews and members of other minorities. Hitler's Germany became a war machine, determined to conquer other countries. For the United States to step forward to defend those helpless people and countries matched the image of the nation in American school books. But is that what really happened? Are there other ways to look at World War II, or questions that did not get asked in the patriotic excitement of the time?
America at war. The war started in 1939 after Germany attacked Poland. Germany had already taken over Austria and Czechoslovakia. Later, the Germans would invade and occupy France. Italy had already invaded the African nation of Ethiopia. Together with some smaller powers, Germany and Italy formed one side in the conflict. They were known as the Axis. Against them stood the Allies. Britain was one of the main Allied powers. Another was Russia, which now had communist government and had been renamed the Soviet Union. The other side of the world was at war too. Japan had attacked China and was moving towards Southeast Asia, which had rich resources of tin, rubber, and oil. What did the United States do while this was happening? Hitler's attacks on the Jews did not bring the United States into the war. Neither did Germany's invasions of other countries, although President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent American aid to Britain, and neither did Japan's attack on China. The United States entered the war after the Japanese attacked an American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7, 1941. This strike, at a link in the American Pacific Empire, was the reason the United States joined the fight, in Europe as well as Asia. Once the United States had joined with England and Russia in the war, what were its goals? Was America fighting for humanitarian reasons or for power and profit? Was it fighting to end the control of some nations by others, or to make sure that controlling nations were friends of the United States? Noble statements such about the government's goals didn't always match the things that were said privately. In August of 1941, Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill announced their goals for the world after the war. They said they respected the right of all peoples to choose from the form of government under which they will live. But 2 weeks earlier, a top U.S. government official had quietly promised the French government that France would regain its empire of overseas territories after the war. Italy had bombed cities when it invaded Ethiopia. German planes had dropped bombs on cities in the Netherlands and England. These were not attacks on military targets. They were attacks on the civilian population. Roosevelt had called them inhumane barbarism that has profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. But the German bombings were very small compared to the British and American bombings of German cities. Raids of 1,000 planes or more targeted cities. They did not even pretend to be seeking only military targets. The climax of the Allied terror bombing was an attack on the German city of Dresden. More than 100,000 people died in a firestorm started by the bombs. During the war, newspaper headlines were full of battles and troop movements. Behind the headlines, American diplomats and businessmen worked hard to make sure that when the war ended, American economic power would be second to none in the world. At the time, poet Archibald MacLeish was an assistant secretary of state. He wrote, "As things are now going, the peace we will make, the peace we seem to be making, will be a piece of oil, a piece of gold, a piece of shipping, a piece, in brief, without moral purpose or human interest." Many people thought that the reason for the war against the Axis was to end the terrible situation of Jews in German-occupied Europe. But that wasn't a chief concern of Roosevelt. While Jews were being put into concentration camps, and Germany was getting ready to begin exterminating 6 million Jews and millions of other minorities and descendants, in what has come to be called the Holocaust. Roosevelt failed to take steps to save some of those doomed lives. He left it to the U.S. State Department, which did nothing. Hitler claimed that the white German race, he called an Aryan or Nordic, was superior to others. Was the war being fought to show that his idea of racial superiority were wrong? American blacks might not have thought so. The nation's armed forces were segregated by race. Even the blood banks that saved thousands of lives kept blood from white people apart from the blood donated by black people. A black doctor named Charles Drew had invented the blood bank system, but when he tried to end blood segregation, he was fired. Blacks in the United States knew the reality of racial prejudice and sometimes racial violence. In everyday life, in 1943, an African-American newspaper printed a poem about the thoughts of a black man drafted into the army. "Dear Lord, today I go to war. To fight, to die. Tell me what for. Dear Lord, I'll fight. I do not fear. Germans or Japs, my fears are here. America." In the way it treated Japanese Americans during the war, the United States came close to the brutal racist oppression that it was supposed to be fighting against. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, anti-Japanese feelings was strong in the government. One congressman said, "I'm for catching every Japanese in America, Alaska, and Hawaii, now and putting them in concentration camps. Let's get rid of them." In 1942, Roosevelt gave the Army power to arrest every Japanese American on the West Coast. 11,000 men, women, and children. 3/4 of them had been born in the United States and were U.S. citizens. The others, born in Japan, could not become U.S. citizens because American law made that impossible. Japanese were taken from their homes and carried into camps in remote regions of the interior. There, they were kept in prison conditions. They remained in those camps for more than 3 years. The war in Europe ended in May 1945 when a beaten Germany surrendered to the Allies. But by August of that year, Japan also was in a desperate shape and ready to surrender. But there was one problem. The Japanese emperor was a holy figure to many of his people, and Japan wanted to keep him in the place after a surrender. If the United States had agreed, Japan would have stopped the war. But the United States refused, and the fighting continued. After the war, the United States allowed the emperor to remain anyway. Japan did give up after the United States dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The bombs killed as many as 150,000 people and left countless others to die slowly of radiation poisoning. It was the first use of these deadly new weapons in war. Why would the United States not take the small step of allowing Japan to keep its emperor if that would have ended the war without the use of atomic weapons. Was it because too much money and work had gone into the atomic bomb not to use it? Or was it because the United States wanted to end the war before the Soviet Union could enter the fight against Japan, as it planned to do? If Japan surrendered to the Soviet Union, then the Russians, not the Americans, would control post-war Japan. Whatever the real reasons for dropping atomic bombs on Japan, at least the war was over. Or was it?
The war at home. The war years were a patriotic time in the United States. The country seemed totally dedicated to winning the war. There was no organized anti-war movement. Only one socialist group came out firmly against the war. It was the Socialist Workers' Party. In 1943, 18 of its members went to jail under a law that made it a crime to join any group that called for the overthrow of government by force and violence. Still, many people thought the war was wrong. About 350,000 of them avoided the draft. More than 40,000 flatly refused to fight. The nation's two biggest groups of labor unions, the AFL and the CIO, had pledged not to go out on strike during the war. Yet there were more strikes during wartime than at any other time in American history. In 1944 alone, more than 1 million workers walked off their jobs in mines, steel mills, and manufacturing plants. Many were angry that their wages stayed the same, while the companies that made weapons and other war materials were earning huge profits. By the end of the war, things seemed better to a lot of people. The war had brought big corporate profits, but it also had brought higher prices for farm crops, wage increases for some workers, and enough prosperity for enough people to keep them from becoming rebellious. It was an old lesson learned by governments. War solves the problem of controlling the citizens. The president of the General Electric Corporation suggested that business and the military should create a permanent wartime economy. That is just what happened. The public was tired of war, but its new president, Harry S. Truman, built a mood of crisis that came to be called the Cold War. In the Cold War, America's enemy was the communist country that had been its ally in World War II, the Soviet Union.
New wars. The rivalry with the Soviet Union was real. The former Russia was making an amazing comeback from the war. It was rebuilding its economy and regaining military strength. The Truman administration presented the Soviet Union as something worse than a rival. The Soviet Union and communism itself were seen as immediate threats. The U.S. government encouraged fear of communism. Any communism-related revolutionary movement in Europe or Asia was made to look as if the Soviets were taking over more of the world. When communist-led revolutionaries gained control of the Chinese government in 1949, China became the world's most populous communist nation and added fuel to America's fear. The growing fear of the Soviet power and communism in general led to a big increase in the U.S. military spending. It also led to new political partnerships between conservatives and liberals. In politics, a conservative is someone who wants to preserve the existing order of society, government, and the economy. Conservatives tend to place a high value on security, stability, and established institutions. A liberal is someone who supports progress, often through change. If changes are extreme, a liberal may be called a radical. Liberals tend to place a high value on individual rights, civil liberties, and direct participation in government. The United States wanted to unite conservatives and liberals, and Republicans and Democrats in support of the Cold War and the fight against communism. Events in Asia nation of Korea helped President Truman get that support. After World War II, Korea had been freed from Japanese control and divided into two countries. North Korea was a socialist dictatorship, part of the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. South Korea was a conservative dictatorship in the American sphere of influence. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations, which had been created during the war and was dominated by the United States, asked its member nations to help South Korea. Truman sent U.S. forces, and the United Nations Army became the American Army. When American forces pushed all the way through North Korea to the Chinese border, China entered the fighting on the side of North Korea. In 3 years, the war killed as many as 2 million Koreans and reduced North and South Korea to ruins. Yet when the fighting ended in 1953, the boundary between the two Koreas was where it had been before. If the Korea War changed little in Korea, it had an effect in the United States. It caused many liberals to join with conservatives in supporting the president, the war, and the military economy. This meant trouble for radical critics who stayed outside the circle of agreement.
The left had become a force during the Depression and the war. The Communist Party probably never had more than about 100,000 members, but it had influence in the labor unions, in the arts, and among Americans who had seen the failure of capitalism in the 1930s. To make capitalism more secure, to build support for an American victory over communist foes, the nation's established powers of government and business had to weaken the left. They did so by attacking communism. The hunt for Reds, as communists were called, soon filled American life. In 1947, Truman launched a program to search out disloyal persons in the U.S. government. In the next 5 years, more than 6.5 million government employees were investigated. In their book, The 50s, historians Douglas Miller and Marion Nowak described the results. Not a single case of espionage was uncovered, though about 500 persons were dismissed in dubious cases of questionable loyalty. All of this was conducted with secret evidence, secret and often paid informers, and neither judge nor jury. A conservative and fearful reaction coursed the country. Americans became convinced of the need for absolute security and the preservation of the established order. World events built support for this anti-communist crusade. Communist parties came to power in places like Czechoslovakia and China. Revolutionary movements flared up in Asia and Africa, where colonial peoples demanded independence from European powers. These events were presented to the American public as signs of a worldwide communist plot. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin began his own crusade to find communist traitors in the country's State Department and the military. He found nothing and eventually became an embarrassment to the government. Other political leaders, however, had their own ideas for crushing dissent. Liberal senators Hubert Humphrey and Herbert Lehman suggested that suspected communists and traitors could be held without trial in concentration camps. The camps were set up and ready for use. The government also made lists of hundreds of organizations that it considered suspicious. Anyone who joined these groups, or even seemed sympathetic to them, could be investigated. Leaders of the Communist Party were jailed. In 1950, the government charged Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, known to be connected with the Communist Party, with giving atomic secrets to the Soviets. Although the evidence against the Rosenbergs was weak, they were executed as spies. Later investigations proved that the case was deeply flawed. But at the time, everything from movies and comic strips to history lessons and newspapers urged Americans to fight communism. By 1960, the establishment seemed to have succeeded in weakening the left. The communist radical upsurge of the New Deal and the wartime years had been broken up. The Cold War kept the country in a permanent war economy. There were big pockets of poverty, but enough people were making enough money to keep things quiet. Everything seemed under control. And then, in the 1960s, rebellions exploded in every area of American life.
We hope today's reading helped you understand what conflicts were at the heart of World War II, why the United States entered into the war, the impacts of the war on Japanese Americans, who benefited from the wartime economy and who didn't, and the impacts of the United States' response to communism and how it affected those at home and abroad.
As we bring today's lesson to a close, we'll end by asking everyone to reflect on the following question. What was something that you learned from the text that you didn't learn about in school?
I remember from my social studies classes learning about how Americans responded to the war by rationing their own supplies and growing their own food in victory gardens. What I didn't learn, though, was about how there were strikes that continued on during this time in protest of the war, and how workers continue to suffer from the high cost of living and low wages.
Yeah, I really thought that this chapter helped highlight how governments and corporations benefit from like wartime economies that really keep the citizens in line. One part that really stuck out to me was the president of the General Electric Corporation when he suggested that we should create kind of a permanent wartime economy because ultimately that's more profitable for businesses and for government.
So true. Well, thank you for joining our lesson, but know that you can also take a deeper dive. Now we want you to take a deeper dive into the impacts of detention on Japanese Americans. We will welcome you to check out the links shared on the Civic U site under today's lesson.
There, you will find a link to 10 short documentaries about Japanese American incarceration. These short films show the human impact of the detention of these Americans and the injustices that they suffered.
You can also check out a short article from a teacher who talks about how she found a creative way to help students understand the misuse of the term relocation, as was used in the US when referring to Japanese detention. It really gets you thinking.
Well, we hope that you all enjoyed today's lessons, and we hope to see you next time.
See you next time.